Hello everyone, I am Nat1995 here in the video game fanfic plot. Sorry if you guys could hear my little brother yelling in the background. He doesn't know how to be quiet while I'm recording. And just a brief note, 63% of you guys have not subscribed to the YouTube channel. If you can, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and help me reach 400 subscribers. That'll be very appreciated. And now, on to the episodes.
Chapter 44. The Day the Sushi Flew. A Daily Prophet exclusive. Inside the True Wizard Tournament's Yule Ball, my date with Harry Potter. Who wore what? Who went with whom? Details, gossip, and fashion. Plus. Could the First Wizarding War have been avoided? Is Albus Dumbledore telling lies about Harry Potter? Grindelwald, you know who, and Harry Potter, is there a trend? By Rita Skeeter. Hogwarts is always magical, but it has always been especially so around Christmas. With decorated trees, suits of armor singing Yuletide carols, and the snow on the ground make it seem clean, crisp, and beautiful. This year the staff outdid themselves for the season, and as I walked into the castle to meet my date for the traditional Yule Ball, held this year because of the True Wizard Tournament, my eyes were met with the splendor. It didn't take long to find him though. Harry Potter was standing tall with his group of friends, and he greeted me in a manner that spoke of a high society pureblood, despite his half-blood, raised by Muzz status. Which is more than I can say about Draco Malfoy and Pansy Parkinson, who both made very rude and snide comments about Mr. Potter not having a real date for the ball, and commented on Mr. Potter's robes by saying how cheap they looked. I can personally vouch for my date's robes, and I tell you that Mr. Potter's emerald green and silver robes were made from the finest silk available and were expertly made. Minerva Mcgonagall, the deputy headmistress who was wearing a lovely set of red tartan robes with an unusual arrangement of thistles in her hat, began ushering everyone, except the champions and their dates, into the Great Hall. During this time, I had a rare opportunity to speak with the champions. I asked them about their thoughts on Albus Dumbledore's letter to the Wizarding World, and if they were frightened about being alone with Mr. Potter at that point. It seems that none of them were. I don't believe the rubbish that Professor Dumbledore is saying about Harry, Cedric Diggory said. I just don't see it. I personally think he is making the whole thing up. It makes Hogwarts look bad. And Headmaster Dumbledore should be ashamed of himself for saying those horrible things about a little boy, said Fleur Delacour, the Buxbaton's champion who was wearing robes of beautiful silver satin. We from Durmstrang agree. Victor Crumb commented. Headmaster Dumbledore should be ashamed of himself. Victor Crumb's date, Hermione Granger, a beautiful mole-born girl who was wearing a gorgeous set of flowing periwinkle robes, only had one worry on her mind, but it wasn't Harry Potter. I was attacked by Pansy Parkinson and her group of friends on our last Hogsmeade trip, but Professor Dumbledore did nothing about it. I'm worried that they will try it again. I spent 2 days in the hospital wing because of those Slytherin girls. Victor Crumb scowled deeply at this point and became angry when he said, Yes, I too am upset by Headmaster Dumbledore's lack of action for the attack on Hermione. He should have done more. Hermione and all Melbournes should feel safe here at Hogwarts. For someone who holds Melbournes in high regard, he sure didn't do anything about it. Mr. Potter said as he shook his head sadly. My dear readers, at this point I was shocked because I felt sure Professor Dumbledore would take immediate action against a travesty such as this. Could it be that Albus Dumbledore is getting lax on his views about Melbournes, or does his lack of action on Miss Granger's attack have more to do with her being good friends with Mr. Potter? Perhaps it was both. As you may already know, Mr. Potter and Miss Granger have been friends since their first day on the Hogwarts Express, and consider themselves more than just friends. They look at each other as brother and sister. I asked Mr. Potter if he felt betrayed that Miss Granger was Mr. Crumb's date for the ball, seeing as both young men are champions, but he just laughed. No, I think it's wonderful really. This competition is about international magical cooperation. Besides, who wants to go on a date with their brother? If you are anything like me, myself, and I dear readers, I know you chuckled over that gem of a comment. While a part of me wishes I could tell you of hateful, vengeful, and contempt feelings among the 4 champions, the truth is, there isn't. All the champions hold each other in high regard and consider themselves friends and respect each other, which I do think is lovely. But by now you have to be wondering what effect Albus Dumbledore's shameful letter has had on Mr. Potter, and you may be wondering why me, myself, and I was his date, instead of a lovely young witch his own age. Well my dears, it's because of the letter. It's sad that a handsome, charming, and good-natured young man like Mr. Potter had to resort to asking me as his date. While I am flattered he thought about me, seeing as he knew how much I'd love to be there, it really shouldn't have been. Because of the headmaster's letter, no respectable young lady his own age wanted to be seen with Mr. Potter that evening. Why the headmaster felt the need to make up lies about Harry Potter and caused the young man more worries is anyone's guess. Especially since the solution to finding out, for certain, if Mr. Potter is an aspiring Dark Lord is so close at hand. How, you may ask? One word, my love, lies. Fox. Fox, Albus Dumbledore's own bonded phoenix. A notion was brought up at dinner by Professor R.J. Lapin, who teaches defense against the dark arts. He proposed a brilliant idea. Just have Fox search Mr. Potter's soul to see if it is light. This idea was widely popular with everyone sitting near us during dinner, including Mr. Potter himself. Please, I'd love to have my soul searched. He already did it once before and you said that my soul was light. Why can't he do it again? I have nothing to worry about. I'm not an aspiring Dark Lord. Please have Fox search me. Mr. Potter pleaded. But Albus Dumbledore cruelly denied Mr. Potter the right to have Fox search his soul by saying, "Now is not the proper time." He always does that, a disgusted Minerva Mcgonagall said later in the evening. Albus is always trying to deny Mr. Potter the right to defend himself. He fired me, you know, because I disagree with how he treats Mr. Potter. I do not think the boy is an aspiring Dark Lord and I have been very vocal about it, so Albus fired me for it. He eventually changed his mind when others said they would leave as well. This is shocking, my lovely readers. Is there a split within the walls of Hogwarts? Anyone who is anyone knows that Professor Minerva Mcgonagall is a fierce and strict teacher. She's not afraid to call out anyone who is acting up, or acting in an improper way, and it seems that the headmaster is no exception. Are the professors fighting amongst themselves? If Minerva Mcgonagall and others such as Pomona Sprout and Phileas Flitwick, both head of Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw respectively, threatened to leave because of the headmaster's behavior, then this could be bad news for Albus Dumbledore. But why won't Albus Dumbledore just have his phoenix search Mr. Potter's soul? No one seems to know, but there is a running theory. Albus Dumbledore doesn't want to be proven wrong. I think he looks under every rock to try and find a Dark Lord to vanquish, said Gordon Ruffin Sr., the father of Mr. Potter's best friend, Gordon Ruffin Jr. I personally think the headmaster tries to keep himself relevant because of it. It seems to me that he needs that fame. He's a glory hound. Could this be true? First Grindelwald, then you know who, and now Harry Potter? Now no one is denying the horror that the 2 former Dark Wizards have wrought on us in the past, but to throw Mr. Potter, a mere young man of 14, into that horrible mix is quite a stretch. Mr. Ruffin even suggested that his son's own phoenix would have told his son that Mr. Potter's soul is dark, which led Albus Dumbledore to imply that Mr. Ruffin's son is ignoring the phoenix's warnings. As you can imagine, Mr. Ruffin was highly insulted by the headmaster's callous words. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Dumbledore," Mr. Ruffin angrily said at dinner. "If you knew all about you-know-who when he was a young man, why didn't you stop him then? The war could have been avoided, and lots of innocent people wouldn't have died if you had taken action before he became so powerful. A very interesting question, and Albus Dumbledore replied with silence. Silence. Me, myself, and I went on to ask Albus Dumbledore if the Wizarding War was partly his fault, but Dumbledore sidestepped the question by promptly announcing that dinner was over and that the dancing needed to begin. It makes one wonder what the great headmaster of Hogwarts is hiding, and it makes one wonder why he refuses to answer these very important questions. The rest of the evening was lovely though. The sea of color from everyone's dress robes was striking in contrast to the normal black of everyone's school uniforms. Everyone was happy, and after several dances of various tempos, which I must say, Mr. Potter is an exceptional dancer, I snuck off to mingle with the crowd. During this time, I observed Mr. Potter dancing with several friends and professors alike. He also shared a dance with Mr. Liquor, Miss Granger, and even a few others that didn't seem to mind his presence. I overheard people talking about him though. People like Daphne Greengrass, who was wearing an exquisite set of green velvet robes, said that Harry Potter was a nice boy, and her date, Blaise Zabini, who is one of Mr. Potter's good friends, had nothing bad to say either. Neville Longbottom and Hannah Abbott, both Bullards and friends of Mr. Potter, looked lovely together, and Miss Abbott especially looked fetching in her solid black robes with a yellow silk sash. No doubt a nod to her house. However, as I wandered over to a group of Slytherins, I overheard the nastiest things coming from them, and even as a Slytherin myself, I was appalled by the hateful remarks. Millicent Bulstrode, who is no princess, nearly snarled in Mr. Potter and Miss Granger's direction when they were dancing together. It is my belief that Miss Bulstrode was highly jealous of the beautiful Miss Granger, seeing as Miss Bulstrode, a pureblood, was wearing a rubbish bag for dress robes. Mr. Vincent Crabbe and Mr. Gregory Gall were without dates, though one would think they were there with Draco Malfoy. All three of them spent their time whining about Mr. Potter and how stupid he is. Until Mr. Malfoy changed the subject and began talking about his father, which seems to be a favorite topic of his. My father could throw a better ball than this. This is a ball for servants and those less worthy. Just look at Weasley. He scoffed. He is so poor that this will be the nicest ball he ever attends. And Bones looks like a cow. Pansy Parkinson commented right after. I personally think that Ron Weasley and his date looked lovely together. Young Miss Susan Bones was wearing a charming set of cheerful yellow-fitted robes that worked very well with her striking red hair, which was pulled into an equally charming ornate braid. However, Mr. Malfoy and Miss Parkinson are not ones to talk really. Mr. Malfoy and Miss Parkinson, despite their wealth and Bullard standings, looked like two 5-year-olds dressed up for Mummy and Daddy's boring political meetings. Mr. Malfoy had on a drab set of black robes, while Miss Parkinson, a pug-faced looking girl, was wearing an awful set of pink robes that looked more like curtains that had been shredded by an angry cat. But I digress. As the evening drew to a close, I reunited with Mr. Potter, and as the perfect gentleman that he is, he walked me all the way to the front gates of the grounds, and saw me off safely with a bow and small kiss on the back of my hand. All in all, I had a lovely evening, and if I was a much younger witch, I'd claim Mr. Potter all for myself, but alas, I'm not. I just hope that when Albus Dumbledore is finally proven wrong about Mr. Potter, that everyone will be able to look past the headmaster's slandering, and see Harry Potter for who he really is. A true gentleman, a hero, and a wonderful, down-to-earth, light-hearted young man. Until next time, my rabid readers. Rita Skeeter. It had been a week since the Yule Ball, and the Great Hall was silent as everyone devoured Rita's latest article. Salazar glanced up at the head table to see Minerva smirking, Remus chuckling, Sprout and Flitwick grinning, and Severus, as usual, scowling. What really amused Salazar was the fact that other professors were casting questioning glances at Albus, who sat in his chair glowering right at Salazar, who for the last week walked around the school with Nahum perched happily on his shoulder. According to Godric, Nahum was perfectly fine with this arrangement, and Godric had even asked Nahum to study Salazar's soul just to be sure. Of course the results came back light as expected, but it was hysterical to watch everyone's reactions as Nahum cooed, sang, nipped at Salazar's ears, and preened his hair in contented manner. They wanted to run away from him in fear, but the presence of Nahum seemed to root them to the spot and they only stared at Salazar in confusion. During this time there had been an influx of people heading to the library in order to check out books on the behaviors of phoenixes, which seemed to irritate Albus to no end. The only one who complained about the newest arrangement was Nora, who constantly grumbled about show-off peacocks hogging all the attention, and she even threatened to bite him, which seemed to amuse Nahum. The rest of the Christmas holidays had been wonderful though. Merlin once again porked the Potters in for Christmas, and even though he couldn't spend more than a few hours with them, Salazar had fun slipping off the grounds to go see them. Harry was a little let down that he couldn't spend the whole break with his grandpa and Uncle Salazar, but the lad understood why. James and Lily told him they were furious with Dumbledore and his letter, and Merlin had to almost physically restrain them from heading up to Hogwarts and cursing the headmaster. James sincerely hoped that the Potter name wouldn't be forever tarnished because of the old goat's stupidity, but Merlin told them all that once the truth finally came out, it would be all right. Salazar just hoped the ancient wizard was right. How could that woman say that about me? I'll have her job. Pansy Parkinson suddenly yelled, causing everyone in the Great Hall to stare at her. What is she talking about? Millicent Bulstrode shrieked. My dress robes cost 50 galleons. Salazar, Godric, and the children were sitting in their normal spot at the Slytherin table along with Grum, looked up to see Pansy and Millicent glaring at the paper in disbelief. How could she call me pug-faced, and her? Pansy sneered as she pointed at Hermione, beautiful. She's just a mudblood. Miss Parkinson. Minerva shouted. 10 points from Slytherin, and see me after breakfast. Pansy glared at her, but then scowled even more at Hermione, who chuckled and shrugged her shoulders. Crumb scowled at the girl, causing Pansy to whimper, but she got up and ran out the room when Neville glared at her. Draco pointedly set his copy of the paper on fire, sneered at Salazar, and followed her out with Grab and Goyle hot on his heels. I see once again that Headmaster Dumbledore is not going to take action, Crumb said with a scowl, as Albus did nothing but continue to eat his breakfast. He is a cowardly man. If you can believe it, he is a Gryffindor, though an unworthy one I'd say. Godric grumbled. I want to bite him, Nora said, as she peered over Salazar's copy of the paper in order to glare at Nahum. You want to bite everyone, my dear? Could you be more specific? Salazar asked, causing nearly everyone to snort. She hissed in annoyance. You, the peacock, Dumbly, and Jolly. Me? Godric asked, looking at her in shock. Why? Because that stupid screaming egg woke me up this morning because you just had to study it, she replied, flicking him on the arm with her tail. Oh, is that why you're in a bad mood? I'm sorry I woke you up, Nora. Godric chuckled, as Hermione quietly giggled and translated the conversation for Crumb. I was trying to see what I could make of it. I say we just throw the stupid thing into the lake, so that the sushi has to deal with it. It would make for quieter mornings. She huffed, as Hermione continued to translate. Godric suddenly gasped and looked up with a sudden start. He glanced at Grum, then Salazar, then back to Crumb, who began chuckling. I have already figured it out, he admitted with a small smile. It is all right to talk freely if you wish, but I understand if you don't. What is it? Salazar asked, as he stared at Godric with a clueless expression, then glanced at Grum. The egg. I just realized what that sound is, Godric said as he jumped up. Salazar glanced at Grum, who just shrugged. I could leave if you want me to," he said kindly, but Salazar shook his head. "If you say you have figured it out, I believe you, but I must grab Cedric." Crumb laughed. "I don't mind if you do, and you will understand why when you figure out the egg. Shall I ask Fleur to come? I think she already knows too." Salazar hesitated. He really only wanted to talk to Cedric, but if Grum and Fleur had already figured it out, then what was the harm? They could test them to be sure. "Might as well," Salazar said, nodding at Crumb. "Are we going to the snake pit?" Blaise asked as they all stood up. "Yeah," Godric answered. "Hermione, you get Crumb and Fleur down there, the rest of you come with me," he said, dragging Salazar by the arm towards the doors. Salazar only had a split second to grab a hold of a very surprised Cedric, who let out a yelp and dropped his fork, as Godric continued dragging him out the room. Nearly everyone in the Great Hall looked confused as all four champions, and a gaggle of Salazar's friends, headed out the room. Fred and George saw what was happening from their seat at the Gryffindor table, and made a mad dash after them. "This is where you live," Cedric cried as he gazed around the snake pit. That is, after he got over his shock of seeing Emerald up close. Salazar laughed. "Yeah," he replied as Hermione, Crumb, and Fleur made their way down. "What is this about?" Victor said. "It has something to do with the second task," Fleur said as she gazed around the room. They all headed into the sitting room, and Fleur shrieked and began shaking at the sight of a giant squid stuck to one of the large windows. We have to?" she stuttered as she flattened herself against the opposite wall. "He's not going to hurt you. In fact, he is very friendly," Cedric assured her. Then he looked at Salazar curiously. "So Harry, what is this about?" "I have no idea. You have to ask Gordy," Salazar said, shrugging his shoulders as he pointed towards Godric. "Okay, who here besides Harry has not figured out the egg?" Godric asked. The only people who raised their hands were the twins, which made everyone chuckle and shake their head. "I figured it out 2 days ago," Cedric said with a grin. "But I'm still working on a way to actually do it. I realized its secret a week ago," Crumb admitted. "And I agree with you, Cedric, it is proving to be harder than I thought." "I already know what I'm going to do," Fleur said, eyeing everyone suspiciously. "But pardon me for not telling." No one has to talk about what they are going to do for the task. That's not why we are here," Godric quickly assured her. "I was just asking because I wasn't sure." "Can we obtain some proof?" Salazar asked, eyeing them all. "Sure, Harry," Cedric laughed. "It's not really figuring out the egg that's the problem, it's completing the task." "I agree," Fleur and Grum said together as they nodded. "I'll start so that you know we aren't lying, though I hope you have a bathtub in here somewhere," Cedric laughed. "I'll just pick a line. To recover what we took," he said with a grin, as Fleur chuckled. "Let's see, it won't come back," she said. "While you're searching, ponder this," Crumb added with a grin. "Yep, we all know." "Do you, Harry?" Cedric asked, looking at him curiously. "No, but I think." He was interrupted by a shout from Nora as she caught sight of Godric grabbing the egg. "Jolly, don't you dare!" she shouted. "I hate the screaming egg. I will bite you." Godric burst out laughing. "Calm down, Nora, it won't scream." "But to answer your question, Cedric, no, we don't have a bathtub, but we do have a waterfall." "Gordy, will you just get to the point?" Salazar said, rolling his eyes. "What they said proves they have figured it out, so me doing what I'm about to do isn't going to hurt anything. Now listen, because of Nora's comment about throwing the egg in the lake, I realized what the sound was. I lived on a very small hidden island off the coast of Blackpool for a while." He suddenly stammered. "Here, watch this." Godric laid the egg in the shallow pool of the waterfall, which was only about 2 feet deep, and grinned as he opened it. To everyone's surprise, except Crumb, Cedric, and Fleur, it didn't start screaming. The screaming is what a mermaid sounds like above water. The Irish Sea, which is where the hidden island is located, has a colony of merpeople. Stick your rear in the pool, Godric said with a grin. Salazar stared at Godric, then whacked himself in the forehead. I should have known that. Yeah, Godric laughed. Water, now. He chuckled, pointing to the egg. Salazar got on his knees and stuck his ear just under the water, and what he heard made him shudder. Come seek us where our voices sound. We cannot sing above the ground. And while you're searching, ponder this. We've taken what you'll sorely miss. An hour long you'll have to look. And to recover what we took. But past an hour, the prospect's black. Too late, it's gone, it won't come back. Salazar stood up and stared at Godric in horror. There is no bloody way I'm taking a swim in the Black Lake in the middle of February, he shouted, which caused the other 3 champions to burst out laughing. That is what I said, but we have to, Fleur said with a shrug as she sat down in Salazar's favorite chair. His outburst caused Godric and the children to quickly scramble over to the shallow pool of water so that they could listen to the song. When they pulled away they stared at the 4 champions with wide eyes. How in the world are you going to be able to breathe underwater for an hour? Blaze cried. Don't know. Cedric laughed. It's like we said, it's not really figuring out the egg, it's figuring out how to do the task. I agree, Fleur said as she picked up Blaze's book of advanced charms that was sitting on the table, and began flipping through the pages. I already know what I'm doing though. She added. Harry? Neville asked, looking at him curiously, as Salazar paced back and forth in front of the large window that the squid was stuck to. Well, I know what I'm not going to do, which is take a dip in the freezing cold lake. I'm a snake, not a fish. In more ways than one. Godric grinned, causing Salazar to glare at him, and silently threatened to end his life if he spilled the beans about his animagus form. But Harry, how will you find what has been taken if you don't swim? Hermione asked, furrowing her brow in confusion. Since I'll be coming in last anyway, I'll just say this. I'm not swimming. But. Still not swimming, Salazar said, looking at her pointedly. Let's put it this way. Howlers in my first year. The twins gasped as their eyes widened with the memory of Salazar freezing their mother's howlers, and instantly understood what he was getting at. Cedric was a little slow on the uptake, but Salazar had to give the Hufflepuff credit because he didn't give away the fact that he also realized what Salazar was talking about. Fleur and Crumb looked confused, but they remained quiet. Hermione, on the other hand, continued to ask questions. But Harry, if what the mermaids took is under the water, how are you going to get it back if you don't swim? She asked. Salazar chuckled. I have my ways, he said with a mysterious smile, but she still looked confused. A problem doesn't always have to be solved logically, Hermione. Sometimes it takes a bit of cunning to arrive at a solution. Just trust me, he said with a grin, causing the twins and Neville to burst out laughing. You're a true Slytherin, Harry, Cedric said with a chuckle as he shook his head. I should hope so, Salazar said with a chuckle, causing everyone to laugh even harder. A few days after having heard the egg's song, Cedric pulled Salazar aside and apologized for not telling him about the egg, but explained that he wanted to have it all figured out before he told Salazar anything. Cedric then told him that he planned on using the bubble head charm, which he had found the night before, and gave Salazar the incantation for it, if he decided he actually needed to swim. Salazar admitted that he had spouted off the information about the frozen howlers in a misleading way, and told Cedric not to worry. In the middle of February, the lake is already completely frozen over, so he would just walk across the ice towards the mermaid colony. Salazar then told Cedric that he had read the book Hogwarts, A History, and it mentioned that the four founders had made a deal with some mer people, who kept being spotted by muggles off the coast of Cornwall, England. They brought the mer people to Hogwarts and allowed them to live in the Black Lake, where they made themselves comfortable in the middle and at the very bottom. Salazar told Cedric that if he wanted to swim under the ice then that was up to him, and reminded the young lad about using the hot water charm in order to melt the ice when he came back up. However, Salazar told him that he was going to walk because all they needed to do was get to the middle of the lake. Cedric then asked him how he planned to get back what had been taken from him, but Salazar just grinned and told Cedric that he would simply summon it. Salazar was fiercely determined not to freeze to death. With the stress of the Yule Ball having long been over, and with the contentment of knowing what the egg was and how to get through the second task, the month of January and the first weeks of February flew by for Salazar. Even the uproar over Albus's letter to the paper had somewhat died down. Parents had apparently been writing to their children warning them to stay away from the evil Slytherin, but the children had been writing back to tell them about Nahum the Phoenix, and how he sat on Harry Potter's shoulder. It may have been a while since Nahum had done that, but the effect it had on everyone at the school seemed to put all their fears to rest, and eventually talk about him being evil came to a screeching halt. The only person this didn't seem to set well with was Albus, who still maintained his opinion that Salazar was an aspiring Dark Lord. Severus had pretended to be confused over the matter and went to Albus to ask questions, but what he found out really wasn't a surprise. Albus fully believed that Nahum was somehow confused, confounded, or had some other spell placed on him. When Severus pointed out that it couldn't be done, Albus said that it was likely a very dark, very dangerous spell that Salazar had used to trick the Phoenix. Severus walked away from that conversation shaking his head in disbelief. Albus was either being deliberately thick-headed about all this, or worse, he really did believe the drivel he was spouting, and no one seemed to be able to figure out which one it was. However, while things may have calmed down inside Hogwarts, outside of Hogwarts was a different matter. The impact of Rita's article was still having an effect on people because it seemed no one knew what to think anymore. Those with children at Hogwarts who had seen Nahum with Salazar believed Rita Skeeter's articles, and those who didn't, believed Albus's letter. There were even reports of pub brawls where people would challenge each other to a duel because the wizarding world was so divided over the issue. Nicholas had gone to the ministry to speak to his contacts and learned that Fudge believed every word Albus was saying, and because of that, the rest of his staff and several high-ranking officials believed the same thing. Except one person. Percy Weasley. Due to the imprisonment of Crouch Sr., Percy had been promoted to junior assistant to the Minister of Magic, and the lad had been doing his best to fight off the brainless assumption that Harry Potter was an aspiring Dark Lord. Nicholas talked to the young man and warned him not to go too far with correcting those much older and powerful than himself, because that could put him in danger of losing his job. Percy took the old wizard's advice and dialed back on his beliefs just a bit, but he still held them firm and would not hesitate to tell anyone who asked what his thoughts were. In the misuse of Mole Artifacts office, Arthur had convinced his co-workers of the truth, but in the Era department, Tunks was not as successful. The Eras were split 50-50, and Madame Bones seemed to want to reserve judgment on the matter. While she believed what Susan had said about Nahum, she was unwilling to blindly believe that Harry Potter was good. However, she also knew enough about Albus Dumbledore to not blindly believe anything he had to say, which was why she decided to watch the situation carefully and be ready for anything that might happen. It was finally the night before the second task, and the snake pit was unusually quiet. Nearly everyone was quietly working on various things, or in Salazar's case, staring out of the window into the lake. The twins were quietly working over a simmering cauldron, on some kind of concoction of their own making, and having a hushed conversation with Nora. Emeralda was currently sleeping, seeing as she had just got back from hunting. Hermione, Neville, and Blaise were studying for a defense test, and Godric was reading. No. Oh no. No, no, no. Fred suddenly cried, just as George let out a loud yelp. Someone help us. Nora cried, causing Salazar to vault over a chair, a coffee table, and sidestep Neville, who had also jumped to his feet. A small explosion erupted from the cauldron, causing a goopy mess to make an audible splat against the see-through ceiling. Thankfully Blaze was quick enough to vanish the mess, before it came back down and landed all over Emeralda's back. "Do I even want to know?" Salazar asked as he cautiously peered into the now empty cauldron. "Only if you want to take points from Gryffindor," Fred said sheepishly, causing Godric to chuckle. Salazar raised an eyebrow at them, but then smirked. "Let me guess, it's a prank." "Yes, but I'm teaching a class, so you must go," Nora informed him, causing Salazar to look at her curiously. "It's called brewing with Nora, the deadliest snake in the world. Now go away." "You're not using snake venom, are you?" Godric asked sternly, suddenly looking up from his book. This question got the attention of everyone in the room, and they all stared at Fred, George, and Nora with wide eyes. "If we said yes, would we be in trouble?" George asked with a slight squeak. Godric leveled his gaze at the young man, causing George to shrink back against the wall. Salazar, however, only chuckled. "I'm surprised it took you this long to use snake venom. I figured you would have asked me for Nora or Emeralda's venom long before now. Normally it's used for dark potions though, so tell me what it does, and we will decide if we need to stop you," Salazar said calmly. We were just going to prank Dumbledore," Fred said, looking at the two founders awkwardly. "Using a potion that has snake venom as an ingredient?" Godric asked pointedly, folding his arms across his chest. "It's not bad," Fred quickly assured him. "We worked it all out and found that it just needs one tiny little drop from a slightly venomous snake." "Deadliest snake in the world," Nora corrected. "The deadliest snake in the world," Fred said with a slight grin. "It causes someone to walk in a zigzag pattern. We were going to ask Dobby to put it in the headmaster's tea." "Fred!" Hermione cried. "You can't do that." Blaze snorted, but Neville burst out laughing. It would be hysterical to watch Dumbledore forced into walking in a zigzag pattern. "How long does it last?" Neville asked, causing Salazar to chuckle. 3 full days." The twins chorused with grins plastered on their faces. Godric sighed loudly, but gave them a disparaging glance. "I suppose that would be all right, but no more potions with snake venom unless you ask first." "I mean that," he said sternly as he waggled his finger at them. "Yes, sir," they said sincerely as they nodded vigorously. Godric sat back down with a grunt and cast a withering look at Salazar, who just stood there trying not to laugh, but then Salazar looked at the twins. "All right, but you obviously have done something wrong, so let me see your recipe," he said with a grin. He started to read over the piece of paper that they handed him, but then another loud explosion sounded throughout the room, causing them all to jump. However, this one sounded above their heads and they all looked up to see Severus, Albus, Moody, and Minerva standing in the main Slytherin common room, looking down at them. They all furrowed their brows in confusion, but Godric readied the stairs as Salazar summoned the walking through walls potion. He quickly drank a small sip, and scrambled up the stairs to poke his head out of the ceiling floor. "Do you need Blaze and Gordy too?" Salazar asked as he glanced at each of them. "Actually no, Mr. Potter, we only need to speak with Miss Granger and Miss Droffin," Minerva said. Then she glared at Albus, and looked back at Salazar. "They will be coming with us." "All right," Salazar said, looking at her curiously. "We don't want that stupid mudblood." Draco didn't get to finish that remark, seeing as Salazar immediately turned him into a footstool, and quickly banished him into the still blood-protected corner they had used at the beginning of the year. Severus was a little slow in trying to turn Draco back into a human though, and glared at Salazar in disgust. Draco wasn't the only footstool in the corner though. 2 other footstools were stacked neatly against the wall, and they caught the attention of Minerva. "Mr. Potter, are those students?" she cried, staring at them in shock. "Yes, ma'am," Salazar said sheepishly. "Montague is the pretty pink footstool," and he tried to curse Gordy behind his back. "The purple footstool is Goyle, who thought it would be funny to beat up a first-year Hufflepuff, and of course, the red and gold footstool is Draco, who can't seem to control his mouth," he explained. "Gordy and I caught them doing these things today, and put them there ourselves, but they will be returned to normal and unceremoniously ejected from the corner at midnight, where they will land, none too gracefully, on their bums in the middle of the room," Salazar explained with a flourish. Minerva tried her best to hold back a snicker, but it slipped through despite her efforts. Albus and Severus glared at him, but Moody burst out laughing. "I see you have decided to take matters into your own hands, Potter," Moody said with a twisted grin that made Salazar look at him oddly. However, Minerva just shook her head and sighed. 15 points from Slytherin, Mr. Potter, because we are never to use transfiguration as a punishment," she said sternly. "What's the point, Minerva?" Albus said gruffly. "He will just put them back." "Actually, Headmaster, I only do that when you take points," Salazar spat. Then before anyone could say anything, he slipped back down into the snake pit. "What do they want?" Blaise asked. "They only want Hermione and Godric," he said, looking at each of them. "Why?" Hermione asked nervously as she glanced around at the sneering Slytherins. "They didn't say," Salazar answered, glancing at Godric. "Well, we better get up there." Godric sighed. "Don't worry, Hermione. I will look after you." Godric took the walking through walls potion and sipped it before passing it off to Hermione. She made a face because of the taste, but then they headed up through the ceiling, floor. Hermione had her wand in her hand as she glanced around nervously, while Godric positioned himself in order to shield her better. They didn't stand around very long though, and they hurried out the common room, leaving Salazar to stare after them in confusion. "Why did they leave?" Neville asked. "I don't know," Salazar replied as he shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose we will have to wait for Godric to come back and tell us. What time is it anyway?" "We have an hour until curfew," George said as he brandished the potion recipe. "Can you take a look at this for us? If you don't mind, that is." "Of course," Salazar laughed. Before any of them realized it, they only had 10 minutes left until curfew, so the Gryffindors hurried up the entrance tunnel in order to try and make it back to Gryffindor Tower before they got in trouble. "I wonder why Gordy hasn't come back yet," Blaise said as he yawned and stretched. Salazar furrowed his brow and shook his head. "I have no idea. Perhaps it's taking longer than they thought." "I could be," Blaise offered as he put away his herbology homework. "Why don't you get some sleep, because you need a full night's rest?" Salazar nodded slowly. "You're right, and I do need sleep. I don't know why I'm worried, because Godric can take care of himself. I just hope someone hasn't suck up on him or something. Actually, I'll just ask Minerva to see if he's left yet." Salazar cast his Patronus and the spell to allow it to talk, then he sent it off. He really liked this spell because you could have the Patronus talk to a bunch of people at once, or make it to where only one person could hear what it had to say. That came in handy if the person was in a room full of people. A few minutes later, Minerva's cat Patronus came bounding down the entrance tunnel and into the sitting room. "He is still with us, but he's not happy. I can't say any more than that. I'm so sorry." Salazar furrowed his brow as Blaise looked at it in confusion. "Why wouldn't he be happy?" the lad asked. Salazar shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm sure he will wake me up when he gets back. Let's just head to bed." "All right. Good night, Harry." "Good night." Salazar laid in his bed for a while, pondering Minerva's cryptic message, but he eventually drifted off to sleep, unaware of what was happening in other parts of the castle. The next morning Salazar awoke with a start because of someone shaking him. He sat up rather groggily and rubbed his eyes, only to find a worried-looking Blaise peering at him. "Gordy didn't come back last night, and his bed hasn't even been slept in. Are you awake, and understanding what I'm saying, or do I need to splash you with water?" "I could bite him. That would assure us that he is awake," Nora said with a loud hiss. "I wonder where Jolly has run off to though." "Gordrook isn't back?" Salazar asked, blinking rapidly to try and clear his head. "No, he's not," Blaise said nervously. "All right. Let me get up and get dressed so that I can wake up properly. I'll try to find him," Salazar replied. Salazar quickly went about his normal morning routine and hurried into the sitting room, and who he found there made him stop in his tracks. "Neville?" he asked, shoving his glasses on his face, and looking at the nervous lad who was wringing his hands together. "You never come down this early. What's wrong?" "Hermione never came back last night. I waited for her, but I fell asleep on one of the couches in the common room. I asked Lavender Brown to check on her, but she said Hermione never came in, and her bed hasn't even been slept in. I told him it's the same with Gordy," Blaise said, looking at Salazar nervously. "Okay, let's not panic," Salazar said, trying to remain calm. "They are probably at breakfast right now. Let's just get to the Great Hall and find out what's going on." Blaise and Neville nodded, and they all headed for the Great Hall, but when they arrived, they didn't see Gordrook or Hermione anywhere. "Have you seen Hermione?" Salazar asked, as he tapped Crumb, who was sitting at the Slytherin table, on the shoulder. "No, I haven't, which is odd. She promised to meet me this morning so that we could eat together," Crumb replied. "Gordy is missing too," Salazar said, shaking his head, just as Cedric came over. "Something is going on, guys," he whispered. "I can't find Cho, and word has it, Fleur can't find her little sister." The doors to the Great Hall flew open at that moment, and Fleur ran in, casting panicked glances all around the room. She spotted Salazar, Cedric, and Crumb standing over by the Slytherin table and quickly ran over to them. "I can't find Gabrielle. Have any of you seen her? Please, please say you've seen her," she pleaded. They all shook their heads no, but Cedric said, "We can't find Cho, Hermione, or Gordy. They are all missing too." It was then that everything clicked into place for Salazar. "Son of Morgana!" he cried, kicking the wall behind him. Then he turned to the other three stunned champions. "They are what we will sorely miss." "No!" Fleur cried as tears began spilling down her cheeks. "Gabrielle is just a baby. She's only 9 years old. They can't," she said, sinking down into the nearest seat. "This is not right," Salazar said, shaking his head. "Whose brilliant idea was it to use people? I swear to Merlin someone better have a good excuse for this nonsense," he shouted, slipping into Parseltongue because he was so angry. "I can see using a valuable item, or a treasure, or a keepsake one holds dear, but to use a person is outrageous," he shouted. Then he took a deep breath and sat down in his seat with a loud huff. "What time does the task start?" he asked in a raspy tone because of all the shouting he had done. "In half an hour," Cedric replied solemnly, as he shook his head and patted Fleur's shoulders. "But Harry, there is more. There is no ice." "What?" Salazar asked in a somewhat startled way. "There's no ice," Cedric repeated. "The top of the lake has been completely thawed out. It's just cold, cold water. I went out there this morning and discovered it." "Speaker, what do we do now?" Nora asked. "Can I still come with you, or do you have to swim now?" "I don't know. I need time to think," Salazar replied. Then he turned to Cedric. "I'll figure something out. Right now I'm too angry to comprehend half of what is going on." Whose stupid idea was this, anyway? Those in the Department of Magical Games and Sports. An angry voice behind them said. They turned round to find a frowning Minerva looking down at them, but she sighed and continued. The heads of all three schools had to sign off on it though. I personally think it is preposterous, as did Miss Granger and Mr. Ruffin. Mr. Ruffin was so against it that he nearly blew up the headmaster's office. She said with a smirk. But in the end he agreed to this nonsense, seeing as the next choice was to take Mr. Zarbini. Blaise paled drastically. Me? He asked, and she nodded. What about Hermione? Salazar and Grum asked at the same time. And Cho? Cedric added. Miss Granger also agreed, after learning that a younger student from Durmstrang was going to be used. As for Miss Chang, she thought it was romantic and agreed right away. Why did they take Gabrielle? A red-faced Fleur asked, lifting her head up to look at Minerva. I cannot speak for her, Miss Delacour. Minerva said sadly. I was only privy to the Hogwarts students. You may have to ask Madame Maxime about it. They should have taken Roger Davis, not a 9-year-old little girl. Salazar growled. I agree, Fleur said, standing up to go speak with Madame Maxime. They all watched the very loud exchange with interest, but it was an angry Fleur who flounced her way back toward them a few minutes later. I have half a mind to leave Xpitons this very instant, she said with an angry scowl as she sat across from them. Madame Maxime says that using Gabrielle was the only way to ensure that I did my best to win. As if I would have done any less if it was someone or even something else. She huffed. Let me bite her, Nora said, causing Salazar to roll his eyes and ignore her. All right. What we need to do is focus on getting them back safely. They have been down there all night, and I can only hope that they have had charms placed on them to keep away the cold, Salazar said as he shook his head in disgust. Actually, Mr. Potter, Minerva said. They are in an enchanted sleep, so they are not aware. She was cut off by a loud screech from Fleur, as the young witch caught sight of Ludo Bagman and several ministry officials as they entered the great hall. She nearly flew over to them with an angry scowl on her face, and began shouting at them in rapid French. Bagman had gone slightly cross-eyed as Fleur got right in his face and continued her shouting, but when she drew her wand and pointed it at his head, Madame Maxime yelled at her. It was during this time that Salazar really wished he had taken the time to learn French. He knew Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, Latin, and even bits of German and Russian, but French is the one language he had never bothered to learn. He didn't have time to dwell on it though, because it only took 2 long strides for Madame Maxime to get from the head table to where Fleur was in order to restrain her. I apologize for her behavior, Madame Maxime. She is upset that her sister is in the lake. Oh, a clueless Bagman exclaimed happily. Well, I see that all the champions have figured out what they will sorely miss. Good, good. This task should be quite exciting to watch then. Salazar shook his head at the idiot, but laughed when a stinging jinx flew out of Fleur's wand and hit Bagman in the forehead. Then she wrenched her arm out of Madame Maxime's grasp and stomped her way back over to the Slytherin table, where she sat down with an angry grunt. Salazar, Crumb, and Cedric grinned at her, but she just shrugged her shoulders. I am part Veela, so what did you expect? She said in an unconcerned manner. They all burst out laughing, which caused Fleur to laugh with them. Half an hour later all 4 champions were standing on the shores of the Black Lake, dressed in nothing but swim trunks and thin t-shirts, as a cold breeze blew off the water. Fleur, Crumb, and Cedric were craning their necks to try and see how far into the murky depths they could see, but Salazar glared at the slightly rippling, thawed surface. The crowd sat in elevated stands that had been arranged along the opposite shoreline, which was only a half a mile away, and they all could hear the loud, excited chattering and cheering from where they stood. Bagman, the ministry officials, Albus, Karkaroff, and Madame Maxime were all sitting in the judges' box, while Minerva, Moody, Severus and Sprout sat next to them in armchairs that Albus had clearly conjured. Poppy was there as well, and Salazar could see that she had several potions and warm blankets stacked up on a separate table. "Speaker, are you sure you won't have to swim? There is no ice." A disillusioned Nora hissed softly as she tightened her grip on his forearm. He only nodded, but then Bagman, who still had an angry red welt between his eyes, stood up. "The second task of the Triwizard Tournament is about to begin," he cried, as his amplified voice boomed out over the lake. The crowd on the other side could clearly be heard as it erupted into loud cheers. "Each champion has lost something that they must reclaim within an hour's time, for if not, it will be lost forever," he continued, oblivious to the mutinous glares coming from all four champions. "They must retrieve their treasure and come back here in order to receive their scores. Let us begin. 3.2.1, he shouted, and then a loud boom sounded, sending the crowd into a cheering frenzy. Crumb, Fleur, and Cedric immediately headed into the water, but Salazar just stood there glancing around the shore. When he could no longer see the other champions, he began executing his revised plan of attack. "Glacius!" he cried, causing a small strip of water, about a meter wide, to freeze solid in front of him. He cast the spell again on either side of the strip to make it wider, then he cautiously stepped on it, and smirked when it held his weight. The spell had only frozen about 8 inches of water though, so he knew he had to be careful not slip, fall, or otherwise jar it in any way, lest it break up and send him into the freezing cold depths. Salazar continued this pattern, making sure that each piece would hold him before he would walk across it. However, it made for slow progress. About 20 minutes into the task, which only put him about halfway to his destination, he caught sight of a pair of yellow and black swim trunks a foot or so below the surface. That meant Cedric was following his ice path. Salazar chuckled to himself, but he knew he needed to speed up so that at least Cedric could get back first. So he did, and about 10 minutes later, he had reached the middle of the lake. Now, he wasn't exactly sure where the mermaid colony was, but he knew he was in the general area and he began to widen his ice path just a bit, and turned it into a large ice platform. Cedric seemed to know that this was the spot though, and Salazar saw him disappear into the depths below. The crowd was cheering loudly, and even though he was far away, he could hear the twins, Blaze, and Neville loudly chanting his name from the stands. Salazar chuckled to himself, and sat down to wait. His revised plan to retrieve Gordrick from the lake would require him to make sure that all the champions and hostages were out of the water, just in case he made a mistake and ended up drowning someone. And he wouldn't be able to live with himself if that happened. "Speaker, I'm bored. You must amuse me," Nora said, causing Salazar to roll his eyes. "By doing what exactly?" he asked. "Try summoning the sushi. I want to see Dummely's reaction when it comes flying out of the water. Then you must banish the sushi in his direction so I can watch as he runs away screaming," she said. Salazar burst out laughing. "My dear, as much as it would delight me to do that, I can't. The summoning charm will not work on living things. The closest thing I have heard it working on was a donkey, and that is just a story. I don't think it's true." "Have you ever tried it?" she asked. "No, because it can't be done," he answered. "Well then how do you know it won't work, and how do you plan to get Jolly back?" she asked. "I have an idea, but I don't think the fish and the mer people are going to be very happy about it." "Oh, what do you plan to do?" "You will have to wait and see," Salazar replied mysteriously. Nora hissed in annoyance. "Fine then, you must amuse me or I will bite you. Try summoning Jolly anyway." Salazar sighed with irritation. "Very well. Let's see, Axio Gordrick Gryffindor," he half-heartedly said, not expecting anything to happen. It didn't. "See, we can't summon him. I told you, you can't summon living things." "Speaker, I'm not stupid. I know you didn't try hard enough. Try summoning the sushi. You are a very old and powerful wizard. If anyone can summon the sushi, it's you. My dear, the giant squid is much bigger than Godric. If I can't summon a person, then I certainly can't summon the giant squid. Just try, or I will bite you. Rolling his eyes again, Salazar concentrated hard on the giant squid, but just as he got ready to say the incantation, Bagman's voice boomed out across the lake. Due to not being able to get past the grindlows and almost drowning, Fleur Delacour has been forced to forfeit this task because of medical reasons. Salazar turned sharply to see Albus, Madame Maxime, and Poppy dragging a frantic, screaming Fleur out of the water. She was fighting to claw her way back into the lake, but Madame Maxime had her in a tight hold. He was just barely able to make out Poppy wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders, and forcing 2 potions down her throat. That is very unfortunate, Salazar murmured as he shook his head. It's up to us to get Gabrielle back to the surface. By summoning her, Nora said in a silky voice. You're not letting this go, are you? Of course not. Now try to summon the sushi. Salazar sighed and rolled his eyes again, but then he concentrated hard on the squid, and loudly called out, Axio giant squid. A loud, odd sort of sucking, slurping sound came from their left, about halfway from their position to the shore, and the lake started to roil and churn, as if something was fast approaching the surface. Salazar's eyes went as wide as galleons when the giant squid flew out of the lake. Its massive tentacles were flailing wildly as its large body zoomed towards him. In a sheer moment of utter panic, and out of fear of being squashed by the giant beast, Salazar gathered all his strength and power, and loudly cried, Depulso, and banished it towards the shore. Unfortunately, he really hadn't been aiming all that well, and the giant squid went sailing over towards the judge's table. He heard Minerva scream in a very ungryffindorish way, while everyone else scattered like ants. The giant squid came crashing down on the judge's table, just as everyone got out of the way, but then the poor disoriented squid just laid there for a moment, before slowly crawling back into the water. Salazar watched as it quickly swam away, and hoped to Merlin that it was all right. He cast a voice-amplifying charm, and sheepishly looked over at the judges, who were standing around with their mouths open in awe. I am so very sorry about that. I honestly did not think that it would work, he said, as the crowd laughed loudly. I really do hope everyone is okay, but especially the squid. Is there a way to have Hagrid check on it? We will have him look after it, Mr. Potter, but in the future, please don't ever do that again, Minerva said with a shaky voice. The crowd roared with laughter, but it quickly turned to cheers as Cedric and Cho broke the surface of the water. They were about 15 feet off to Salazar's right, and he quickly began creating more ice as he made his way over to them. They are right below us, but it's a long way to the bottom. That's why it took me so long to get back up, Cedric said through chattering teeth, as Salazar helped him to get a sputtering Cho out of the water. Then Cedric pulled himself up and flopped on the surface of the ice, before standing up. The crowd was going nuts and Cedric waved to them, but they were only halfway done, seeing as Cedric and Cho needed to get back to shore. Pardon me for being a little shaken up right now, Salazar said, as he began to, rather awkwardly, help them dry themselves off. I just summoned and banished the giant squid. It went crashing down onto the judge's table. What? They both cried disbelief. I'll tell you about it later. Axio 2 of Poppy's warm blankets, Salazar cried, and they saw Poppy's blankets come zooming over to them. Here, take these, but get back quickly. Fleur is out because she got attacked by grindlows. What about her sister? Cedric asked in alarm, as he threw the blankets over his and Cho's shoulders. Don't worry, I'll get her. You just get back, and be careful. The ice is only 8 inches thick. Cedric nodded and they quickly, but carefully, made their way back to shore. Speaker, you made the sushi fly, Nora said gleefully, Yes, let's not talk about that. I'd rather just forget it, he replied. But it was hysterical. I never saw Dumbly run so fast. Salazar just shook his head and sat down on the ice with his head buried in his hands, as the crowd began chanting "Flying Squid, Flying Squid." He highly suspected the twins were behind it, but Salazar just shook his head and tried to tune them out. "You should try summoning Jolly again," Nora said. "I think I will. I was just going to create a whirlpool and have it bring them gently to the surface by manipulating its flow, but I don't think I have it in me to create another spectacle today." Nora started to reply, but it was cut off as the crowd began cheering loudly again. He looked over to see Ron and Hermione grinning and waving to the crowd. He summoned the rest of Poppy's blankets, and motioned Ron and Hermione over to him. He helped Hermione up as Ron pulled himself onto the ice. Just like he did with Cedric and Cho, he began helping them dry off with the hot air charm, and wrapped them up in blankets. "Fleur is out, but I'll get Gabrielle, so don't worry." Cedric made it back just after the hour was up. "Why haven't you gotten Gordy up yet?" Hermione asked, pulling the blanket tightly around her shoulders. "I can't. It goes with me having to come in last. Besides, I've been preoccupied." "Why is everyone shouting Flying Squid?" Crumb asked, looking at the crowd in confusion. "Because Speaker made the sushi fly," Nora hissed excitedly, causing Hermione to stare at him. "You did what?" she cried loudly. "Later, I promise. Now, get back to shore," Salazar said, ushering them down the ice path. He watched them carefully make their way back to shore, then he turned towards the water, closed his eyes in concentration, and took a deep breath. "Axio Gabrielle Delacour," he cried loudly. To his surprise, she came sailing up out of the water, but he slowed her down with a charm, and gently caught her in his arms. She opened her eyes and seemed to be a bit groggy, but she smiled at him and threw her arms around his neck. "Fleur?" she asked, drawing back and looking around questioningly. Salazar knew she didn't understand much, if any, English, so he shook his head no and pointed to the shore. "I will take you to her," he said, hoping she understood, and she nodded and smiled as Salazar dried her off and wrapped her in a blanket. He repeated the process with Godric, and grinned at his best friend when he came to. "Did you have fun?" Salazar asked, looking at a relieved Godric as he helped him up. Godric began to dry himself off, then Salazar handed him a blanket. "I can't believe they would place humans down there. They knocked us out with a potion, and gave us to the mermaids. I was so angry. Why is Gabrielle here?" he asked, interrupting himself. "I know you were angry. Minerva told us all about it after we figured out what was down there. To answer your question though, Fleur was attacked and almost drowned because of the Grindlows, so I brought Gabrielle up. I couldn't let her stay down there and wait for someone to fetch her later." "Good call," Godric said with a nod. "But how did you get us to the surface?" Salazar sighed loudly and shook his head as he wrapped Gabrielle up in a second blanket. Then Godric picked her up and carried her so she wouldn't have to walk on the ice, and they began heading to shore. "I summoned you," he finally answered. "What?" Godric asked in shock, stopping to stare at him. "Jolly, Speaker made the sushi fly. You should have seen it. He summoned the sushi and banished it towards the judge's table." Dumbly screamed and ran away when it came crashing down on top of him. "What?" Godric cried again. "That's not exactly what happened, but Nora talked me into trying to summon the giant squid. I told her it couldn't be done, because it's not supposed to work on living things, but she threatened to bite me, so I did." "And it worked?" Godric asked. Salazar burst out laughing at the memory. "Yes it did, but it wasn't Albus who screamed, it was actually Minerva. Godric, you have got to watch the pensive memory of it. You will die laughing." Godric grinned. "So you are telling me that you haven't even gotten wet today?" Nope. Salazar replied proudly. They thawed the ice sometime last night, so I just made my own. I have absolutely no intention of getting in that water. Is that so? Godric asked with a wicked gleam in his eye. Godric, don't you dark! He cried, as Godric purposely used his shoulder to slam into him, causing Salazar slip on the ice and fall into the freezing cold water. Then that laughing bloody Gryffindor took off running towards the shore, with a giggling Gabrielle held tightly in his arms.